sitting there thinking about Richard Nixon. He really was the accidental president. You have to excuse my voice. It's a little froggy. I'm getting over being sick. So when Nixon ran in 1960 against JFK, Joe Kennedy reached out to Jimmy Hoffa, the Union, whatever, Sam Giancana in Chicago, and they turned the Union for Kennedy. He won West Virginia and Illinois, and he barely won that election. But what really won him the election was the television set, because for the first time in history, you got to see a presidential debate. And if you listen to it on the radio, everybody will tell you Nixon won. If you watch it on TV, everybody said Kennedy won. So he loses. And then, of course, we know what happened in 1963. Johnson takes over. Well, Johnson knew he was never going to win re-election. He was never going to win a re-election. The only reason he got elected after Kennedy died for the one term was because he basically ran on Kennedy's platform, and people liked Kennedy. Kennedy was a likable guy. So, enter Bobby Kennedy. Now, Bobby Kennedy's the only man I ever heard my father call a fascist. My father hated Bobby Kennedy. But, all that aside, my dad also was part of the civil rights era, Jim Crow, all that, did college down in the South, and saw a lot of the damage that Bobby Kennedy and his goon squad did. Especially there when my dad went to Ole Miss in the 60s, early 60s. So, Bobby Kennedy was supposed to win. Bobby Kennedy would have won. Bobby Kennedy was killed. So Richard Nixon ends up president. He wasn't supposed to be president. Bobby Kennedy was supposed to be president. So now, the powers that be, and this is bipartisan, have a problem. You ever want to hear a fascinating speech? Look up Kennedy or Nixon's 1969 speech to the, I think it's West Point graduates. Fascinating speech. It's incredible. Now, before y'all go off and talk about Watergate and all that other crap, look, we all know every administration spies on every administration. Unless you've been living under a rock for the last 20 years, yeah. And, you know, unless you're over 60, I don't care. You weren't around enough to experience any of it. You just remember what your college professors told you, because they hated Nixon. They hated Nixon because he was a Republican. But, you know, Nixon, in 1969, realized that the Vietnam War was lost and tried to find a way out of it. Strike one. Too many people making money. But then he also wanted to release the Kennedy files. We need to get this over with. Strike two. So then, Nixon's just, he's doing his thing, trying to get us out of Vietnam, trying to, you know, not escalate anything, and he's got Chuck Colson working for him and Henry Kissinger. By the way, if you want a fascinating study those two guys. Love them or hate them, they're two very fascinating individuals. Very fascinating. Nixon understood foreign policy probably better than any president we've ever had. And Kissinger just wasn't afraid to get dirty. He was a mud monster. So then you've got two highly skilled, very dangerous politicians in the White House. So then they get rid of Spiro Agnew, the vice president, and replace him with a CIA man. And I think this was an attempt to control Nixon. Gerald Ford. He was on the Warren Commission, good friends of George H.W. Bush. We'll get to him in a minute. So Watergate comes out, and Nixon could have fought it, and he could have won except for one person. George H.W. Bush sat there and pulled all the Republican support away from him. So you got a CIA man as vice president. You got Bob Woodward, an ex-CIA man, leaking the story. And you've got an ex-CIA man, George H.W. Bush. Now, if you ever go through the annals of history, his name just keeps popping up everywhere. He's a dirty SOB. He was. The more I learn about him, the less I like him. And I'm a conservative. Just an absolutely horrible man. The world needs men like him, but they need him in a different capacity, because I think he tended to use his power more for the agency rather than the good of the country. Anyways, so then Nixon is thrown out of office. Suddenly, the Kennedy papers are safe. Ford rides it through. Ford was never going to win. And then they replace Ford with Jimmy Carter. Probably a very sweet man, very unwitting man who had a lot of great plans, who learned way too late that these people didn't care about his plans. They wanted him there for a specific reason. And that poor man was over his head. He was over his head way, yeah. I like Jimmy. You ever watch the debates between him and Reagan? He's an absolute gentleman. You can tell he's a very nice man. Had some good ideas, but they weren't practical. But Reagan was a showman. He knew how to work it, and he did. Television got him elected, but he also had credit to his name because he was a very well-known man. So Nixon shoved out. So I remember Chuck Colson talking about meeting Nixon after he resigned. It's probably in the late 70s, early 80s. He was talking to Nixon, and he says, I have to know, did Johnson have anything to do with it? He says, because Nixon was a very forward-thinking man. Nixon didn't dwell on the past. He didn't talk about the past. It wasn't important to him. But they said you get a couple martinis in him and he would loosen up. And Nixon believed that Johnson had something to do with the Kennedy assassination. And Nixon would know. So if you ever want a fascinating trip down memory lane about the unintentional, the guy they never wanted for president, look up Richard Nixon. Put Watergate out of your mind and start really actually looking at all the things he did. And you're going to find out he was a very interesting man, very smart man, and he actually did a lot of really good things. Like, look up the Cancer Initiative. He did a lot of good things, but all your college professor wants you to remember him for is Watergate, which was really G. Gordon Liddy and Chuck Colson's idea. There's a G. Gordon Liddy. You ever want to have an interesting dive? That's an interesting dude. So